Hi, I'm Heidi Hedquist. I'm filling in for John Sauvé today on hosting Art and Design. We're here today with Jeff Bolin of Dragun Corporation. As you know, the show is Art and Design, but we are Da Vinci's of sort here and believers in Renaissance and how science and art can work together. So we're going to talk a lot today about what Jeff does at the Dragun Corporation and also how it ties into some of the things that John is actually doing in the art world as well. Thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So one of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about, you're an environmental company, correct?
That's correct.
And Dragun Corporation. Tell me a little bit where that name came from.
Well, we actually get asked that a lot, that people hear our name, Dragun Corporation, and think it was something we spent a lot of time making up. But actually, it's named after our founder, Dr. James Dragan. Jim was a PhD soil chemist, wrote textbooks on what happens to chemical ABC when it's released into the environment, into soil type XYZ. And unfortunately, we lost Dr. Dragan almost 4 years ago to cancer. But when he founded the firm back in 1988, he set us on a path, and we continue that path today of using science to help our clients deal with environmental issues.
Was he sort of at the forefront of this field?
Well, the field, I guess, in one sense, has been around a long time, but absolutely, I think he was. Dr. Dragan, the environmental laws as we know them today started to come in mid-late 70s. And Dr. Dragan's first role as a PhD soil chemist was with the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. in the late 70s before he branched out and decided to go into the private sector helping people.
So tell us a little bit about what exactly you do as a consulting firm.
Well, you said they weren't going to be hard questions.
Sorry about that, I lied.
It kind of depends on the day. But again, what we do is help people manage their environmental risks. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of people in different ways. But it can be anything from, as I mentioned, environmental regulation. People have to comply with regulations. Manufacturing firms have air discharges and water discharges, and they handle their waste a certain way. So we help people comply with those regulations. That's a part of it. That's trying to keep them out of trouble. We also help people manage their risks when they're buying and selling real estate, because they don't want to buy real estate that has been impacted by historic activity, or they want to make sure they know what they're buying. Certainly people do buy contaminated real estate with brownfields and things of that nature. And then we also help people when sins of the past, I guess, have caught up with them, and there has been contamination. It's gotten into soil, it's gotten into groundwater, it's gotten into vapors and into buildings, and we help them understand that. We help them remediate and or mitigate that, and we help them, if push comes to shove, we help with expert witness litigation support.
Oh. At what stage does a client generally come to you? Is it early on to discover if there's an issue, or it's once something's been found as maybe problematic?
Both.
Okay.
Hopefully they come to us early, because as I said, we want to try to help them stay out of trouble and keep them out of trouble. But quite often their issues pop up when there is a property transaction, when they're selling a company, merger acquisition type things. Those things come to the front. In today's world, we're a litigious society, for better or for worse. And so there's a lot of finger pointing, and we help clients that the finger's being pointed at them that said, you created this mess. And we, again, use our knowledge, our experience, our science to help them understand where they fall in that. Is it their issue? Is it not their issue? Is it partly their issue? It can be any of that component. So they come to us at all different times in that scale.
Sure. Sure, and across industries, correct?
Very much across industries. People quite often think of environmental issues only dealing with you know, the smokestack and the manufacturing industry and those types of things. But we do a fair bit of work in the agricultural industry. We help, you know, dairy farmers, for example. We work with dairy farmers when they're going through a permitting process to, in the same context as manufacturing, where EPA and state regulations and environment apply to manufacturing industry. Some of those cross over and apply to farms and livestock industry.
Sure.
So it's very much across different types of industries.
And you're based here in Farmington Hills, correct?
We are based in Farmington Hills. We've been around 31 years now.
Okay. You're international as well. You have locations in Canada?
We do. We have an office in Windsor, Canada,
Okay.
and more remotely, not remotely in the sense of remote and out of it, but up in Toronto. And so we work both sides of North America here, but we also work internationally. You know, we're a small firm, but our clients take us across the world.
Excellent. Now I understand that you're currently or recently were involved in a high-profile project in Salina, Kansas. Can you tell us anything about that?
I can. Part of it, you know, it's interesting how a firm of our size, we're again a small niche 20-person firm, but we were brought out to Salina, Kansas, similar to what we have going on up here in the Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Oscoda. Was a very large strategic air command base right in Salina, Kansas, and it was the largest strategic air command base in the nation at the time. It closed in the 60s, and they, if you will, quote unquote, gave that back to the community. And since that, like many Air Force bases, they've found that there was legacy contamination in the soil and groundwater at the site. And the government goes around to all these bases and they put in programs to clean them up, to investigate them and clean them up. And at this particular base, the community, Salina, Kansas, the community was not happy with the way the government was proceeding, or not proceeding as the case may be. And what they asked us to do was come in and peer review the work that was done by the government and let them know was it good work, bad work, or indifferent. And what we found was there were some problems with the work that had been done, and our clients, and I give them a lot of credit for the resolve of this community, but our clients decided to sue the federal government so that they could take control of the investigation and cleanup. Community had the interest. The community, it's in their interest to make sure it happens, and they were tired of this very slow process and not getting things done. And then when we came in with our analysis and said, you know, there's some things that haven't been done quite right here, they decided to sue the federal government, and they were successful in the sense, it never did go to court, but they were successful in getting control, that they could take control of this cleanup. And they weren't necessarily at the whim of the government.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a very, as you said, high profile, but it's also was, you know, very rewarding to see this community do that and take that on.
And it had a lot of news coverage, I know, and really had a lot of attention paid to it.
And still does. Still
Wow.
does. So we're still going now with the actual remediation that will be implemented. We've gotten approval of that through the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, KDHE.
Okay.
So they've approved it, and we're moving to the next step. So
Excellent, excellent. And I know you mentioned you do a lot of work overseas as well, such as Malaysia, New Zealand, gosh, all corners of the earth, it appears. So how did that happen?
Well, I think it initially happened, again, it goes back to Dr. Dragan. He was a world-renowned PhD soil chemist, and there's not a lot of those around. So he opened a lot of those doors, but we have other staff that are also very well-known and renowned in their own field. Dr. Sklash, who's a PhD hydrogeologist, he's done work all over the world before he even started with us almost 30 years ago also. But he's done work on water supply for in India and Africa and Australia. And then, more recently, as part of the Dragan Corporation, we've done work in New Zealand, as I mentioned, on behalf of the dairy industry in New Zealand. So not in the I think the typical way you would think of an environmental firm being involved, but we were involved for dairy, and it involves nitrates in groundwater and things of that nature. And then in Malaysia, we were asked to come over and actually train. We did a 3-day training for Petronas, which is the nationalized oil company over there, to help them understand this whole remedial investigation and remediation process. So that was, also very rewarding to be able to go over there and do that.
Excellent. Now, I understand your company has has quite a bit of expertise with environmental isotopes. First of all, can you tell me what an environmental isotope is? Because I know some of our viewers may not know. And secondly, can you tell us a little bit about that expertise?
Yeah, I can. Certainly, again, Dr. Sklash, Dr. Vakili, who work for us, are our isotope specialists, if you will, and their expertise lies in that. I don't purport to be the isotope expert on that, but basically isotopes are, when you think of a chemical, it basically is two different forms of that chemical. A chemical will have, you typically think of a chemical with a nucleus with protons and neutrons and electrons that go around the atom in that. And when we look at the structure of that, the isotope has if you have two different isotopes, this one will have a proton, this one will have a proton, this one may have a neutron, this one will have two neutrons. So it has different number of neutrons, which gives it a different mass.
Gotcha.
But it's the same chemical, it acts the same, but it can be used to differentiate because of their mass differences.
That makes sense.
So again, I'm not the chemist side of it, but we use that isotopic chemistry to help our clients. It's one of the tools that we use to differentiate these chemicals. So we can tell in certain instances, again, I mentioned that some of our clients have the finger pointed at them and said that you put this chemical in the ground, and we can look at that through isotopes and sometimes help our clients say, well, wait a minute, this is different than, we use that chemical, but this is a different form of that chemical than this is, and we're able to separate that. We do that in nitrates in groundwater. We do that in chlorinated chemistries, which are big trichloroethylene and perc that's used in dry cleaners and things like that.
Wow, that has to be a huge advantage.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
You can also, it's interesting, and people find it interesting, you can also date groundwater. So you can understand through isotopic chemistries how old that groundwater is.
Wow.
And if it's tens of thousands of years old, that you can use that knowledge to say, well, if it's 10,000 years old, our chemical couldn't have gotten to it in that amount of time, or it takes a long time to recharge. So you can use not only in differentiating the chemical itself, but also in how old is that groundwater.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Turns it into almost sort of an archaeological study in some ways too.
It does at that, but we always look at it, it's a puzzle.
Sure.
And there's a lot of pieces that have to come in and make sense and go together. And again, this is a tool that we use as part of that puzzle to help build the right picture for people.
Makes perfect sense. Now I know one of the things that is huge just across the board for individuals here in Michigan especially is we're constantly hearing about PFAS. I think a lot of us don't understand what it is. We know it's important and we've got issues with it, but what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, PFAS is call it the chemical of the day, if you will. If you look back in our history, we had DDT, we had PCBs, we've had ALAR for apples. It's interesting, as I look back through those histories, because the chemistries were really good chemistries and helped humanity, if you will, help society with a lot of different things, and then they find as it moves along that maybe because of all the good properties it has, it becomes kind of a bad actor when it's in the environment or in the human body. And PFAS, PFAS, which is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, is a group of chemicals. There's about 4,000 of them as a group. And we're really focused on mainly 2 of them that have come to light, but we are seeing a lot of activity on that here in Michigan especially. Michigan seems to be on the forefront, even ahead of the EPA right now, and I'll say for better or for worse, because as you mentioned, you said a lot of us don't know a lot about it. Well, that's true even in my world.
Okay.
They don't know the true toxicity of that chemical yet. So trying to set a level that's going to be appropriate for what might be bad for human health is difficult when the toxicologists haven't even quite come to agreement on what's appropriate yet. So it's difficult, and when you read everything that you're reading right now, you know, in the back of the mind, it's a little bit maybe, especially here in Michigan with Flint in the background and what happened up at Flint. You know, sometimes the emotional side of it gets a little bit ahead of the science side possibly, and I think we have to be careful and just make sure that we know before we spend a lot of money and a lot of effort ahead of the game, if you will. We know what is an appropriate cleanup level and things of that nature.
Sure.
But you know, PFAS they've been around since the 30s. People will, if you take the PFAS term out and think about Teflon, think about Scotchgard, it's the key ingredient in those, and people loved stain resistance on their carpets and their things, and I love my Gore-Tex, which has PFAS component. So it brought a lot of great things to our lives, but they're finding it now when it gets in groundwater especially that it's an issue.
It's amazing that, you know, how we could, if we could foreshadow when we're creating these incredible things, what we could do. Hopefully, as we move forward, as more things are coming to light, people will be able to foreshadow a little bit. Who knows? Tell us a little bit about the cannabis market. That's another area that, of course, is a hot topic of conversation, something a lot of people are excited about, a lot of people are concerned about. Are there environmental issues coming from the cannabis boom?
Well, you know, Michigan, since November, having legalized it in certain respects for recreational use, where we've seen it play into our world is it is a brand new market. It's opened up. I mentioned that we help people buy and sell properties. There's an awful lot of those cities that are not opting out and opting in to bring cannabis into their local community. Once those cities have done that, people are buying properties a lot in those cities. So we've been involved with a lot of people that are entering that market here. A lot of them are very sophisticated already in the cannabis market. Some of them aren't, but a lot that we've been involved with are, but they're coming from, we've got clients from Canada that are buying properties in Michigan. We've got a client from Florida that's buying properties here in Michigan to expand into that market. So we're helping them understand the environmental liability risks that they might have with buying that piece of property. And it's also different. People think about it just as they're going to have a dispensary, a retail location, but it's also for growing and processing.
Sure.
And with the growing and processing side of it, there's also other environmental concerns that you have to think about before you develop location.
Right.
Do you have enough water supply if you're going to pump from groundwater? There's environmental regulations with that. How are you going to deal with your waste products that you do? Is there going to be an air discharge issue because there can be odors with cannabis? What's your water discharge? So all those things that you think about for smokestack industries play into the cannabis market too.
Wow. And how are people getting educated on that, or is it trial by fire for a lot of these people going into the field?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
And I say that because even the state of Michigan, with our, it's now called EGLE, EGLE, Environmental Great Lakes and Energy, instead of DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. But EGLE is trying to figure out their role in it and which regulations apply and how they apply. So even the government side is trying to figure out how it fits into their regulatory scheme. From those entering the market, I'm finding both on that sense. Like I said, we have some very educated clients in it that are way on the front end of, they've done production in other states, other countries, in Canada. They're coming in with a lot of that knowledge, but because the state doesn't fully understand how they're going to regulate it, they don't know either. So, they're treading slowly and cautiously, but they're coming in, and we've seen a lot of activity.
Okay, great. We also hear a lot, I'm asking you all the common things now, but these are the things that I know our viewers are all intrigued by, and this is helping immensely, so I appreciate you taking so much time with us. We hear a lot about vapor intrusion. If it's, excuse me, I know that it's also affected some people within our viewing area over in Franklin recently, and I know it's a very scary thing to hear about. Can you talk to us a little bit about this issue and what it means?
Sure, and vapor intrusion has become a very, it's become high profile in and of itself. As you mentioned, the issue in Franklin, it's, pick your city, Detroit, Grand Rapids, they've actually had some instances where they've shut down businesses. They did that in Franklin. And what vapor intrusion is a certain type of chemical, volatile organic compounds. If they're in soil and groundwater, they really don't want to be there. They'd rather be in air and vapor.
Sure.
And so they leave that groundwater, they leave that soil particle, and they make their way into soil vapor, and they move up to the surface. They want to be free in the air. When you put a building over the top of that vapor that's trying to get up, it catches on the bottom of the building. It gets trapped there, but it will ultimately try to make itself way into the building, the intrusion part of vapor intrusion. And when it gets into a building, it gets concentrated, doesn't necessarily have the ability as it would in ambient air to just dissipate. Mm-hmm. And so you can get exposure to these chemicals through the chemical getting into vapor. Where we've seen it, it's similar to radon.
Okay.
Which is naturally occurring but gets into vapor, or it gets into building interiors
right.
in the airspace. So when that happens, and different chemicals have different cleanup thresholds, different effects on people. A big one is dry cleaners. Mm-hmm. With, I mentioned perchloroethylene,
right.
which was a dry cleaning solvent. That is one that drives a lot of sometimes it's cleanup, remediation, sometimes it's just mitigation. So when you have these vapors coming into a building, you can mitigate it, similar to what they do in radon, by capturing the vapors under the building and venting them to the outside before they ever get into the building. So you can just mitigate it, not necessarily remediate it, mm-hmm. and you don't have the exposure. So if you can cut off the exposure, you can do that. And that's very, very common in a lot of situations. Where they don't fully remediate.
Interesting. Yeah, it's hard because so many of these things have become such a part of daily life, and it's hard to make adjustments and relearn how to do things. Are there, from the business side and the company side, are there routine environmental issues that a company needs to be concerned with on a day-to-day basis, or a farm, or anything of that nature?
Well, there certainly are routine things. We as a company have been, I'll say fortunate, but it's been part of our plan. We get involved in things like Salina and some big cases. We've been involved in cases that have gone to the Michigan Supreme Court and the federal Supreme Court. And those are fun and those are great. But, every day companies, as I mentioned, compliance related. The compliance is the regulations change often, mm-hmm. maybe not as much as people think, but they change often. There's nuances that change. And so we help clients with those routine things of trying, again, stay out of trouble by staying compliant. Business property transactions happen on a daily basis. People are buying and selling property. And in the transactional side of things, in helping people understand what environmental due diligence they need to do so that they can buy that property, know what they're buying, know that they're not buying, tomorrow's Love Canal type of thing. Those are all routine things that happen. We send out newsletters and things, try to keep our clients abreast of those things, and so that they're not tripped up. Part of our job, I look at it, is educating our clients to those, keeping them abreast of what's happening and educating them so that they can make good business decisions on that side.
Excellent. And one of the things that I mentioned at the top of our interview is John, who normally hosts this show, is also an artist, and he's doing a lot of incredible work utilizing reclaimed materials such as plastic, and he just launched a really beautiful series on that, as well as working with a lot of other artists. I know art tends to be a great way to get messages across, and something that people are drawn to sort of open their eyes, per se. I know, again, there are so many different things as consumers that we focus on, and as artists that we're drawn to. What would you say for a consumer would be the thing that they should pay the closest attention to, or what are the things that are coming across that are maybe most commonly misconstrued? Okay, that was a tough one.
There's a lot of components.
I know, I'm sorry.
A lot of components in it. I think, when I was in college, and I won't date myself too much, but when I was in college, the regulations were just coming out, and I was a wide-eyed, I'm going to go out and save the world, coming out of college with an environmental science degree. And what I've learned over my career is, it's all about management. I mean, I look at all the things that people, that you said that are coming across the news wires these days of, banning plastic straws. Plastic is the worst thing in the world, as one component of it. But even the chemistries that we talked about, the DDTs, I mean, these things all brought they brought a lot to what our society is and our convenience and the things that we do, and they've been great chemistries in that sense. And it all becomes about management. If you manage it correctly, you won't have the waste that people are concerned about. They show the pictures, of the sea turtle with the plastic in it, right. Those kind of things. Our country, the U.S., which seems to get a lot of bad publicity in my mind, we're very much ahead of the curve on our regulations. We've gotten very good at regulating, and to me there's a fine line of too little, too much. You have to have it, but what's the right thing? Because if you look around at everything we have that's been developed through chemistry and manufacturing and those types of things, I think back where we'd be without them.
Sure. And
are we better off with them, and manage it correctly? And anything mismanaged is going to be a bad thing. No. They deforested parts of Michigan at one point because they just came in and that was the way they did it. Now you've got programs in place, they manage it. You can get the products you need out of that forest and still maintain a sustainable forest. So it all becomes a management issue in my mind. And I think, again, I happen to sit on the Government Affairs Committee for Michigan Chemistry Council. And those companies that are involved in there absolutely understand that they have to manage everything that they do, the raw materials and the product they put out.
That makes sense.
What happens to that product once they do it? What are they doing when they bring it in?
No, that makes total sense, and that makes me feel better, that people are learning, and we thank you so much for spending so much time with us today, and everything you've shared with us. It's been very enlightening, very educational, and we appreciate everything you're doing out in this world, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you and give you a glimpse of my world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Heidi.